The Oregon coast in winter is a quiet place, gray and cold, where the fog rolls in thick off the Pacific and settles low over the fishing docks like a secret. Waves slam against the harbor rocks in a dull rhythm, and seagulls circle the water slowly, waiting. On the surface, it's peaceful, but peace can lie. On December 19, 2001, in the sleepy coastal town of Newport, a fisherman noticed something strange floating near the edge of the Slow River. A suitcase wedged against the bank, heavy, unmoving. When authorities arrived and pried it open, they found a woman's body inside, folded like clothes, pale, bruised. Her neck was discolored. Her eyes were still open. Nobody in Newport expected this. Not here. Not in a place where the biggest headlines usually involve fishing permits or fog delays. But what followed would become one of the most chilling, unthinkable family murder cases in American history. At the center of it all, a handsome young father, 3 small children, and a woman who had once believed she'd married a good man. His name was Christian Michael Longo. By the time police found the body, Christian and his 3 children, Zachery, 4-year-old Sadie, and 2-year-old Madison, were nowhere to be found. He had disappeared. No note, no goodbye, just silence. At first, investigators believed he was a grieving husband, perhaps a victim himself. But that changed quickly. The woman in the suitcase was identified as MaryJane Longo, Christian's wife. Soon, the rest of the puzzle began to emerge. Missing persons reports, a series of fake names used at local motels, witnesses at a canoe rental. And then 4 days later, Sadie's tiny body surfaced in Yaquina Bay. She had been drowned. To understand how this could happen, how a smiling, church-going father could annihilate his entire family and vanish, we have to go back before the ocean, before the lies, before the murders. Christian was born in Ypsilanti, Michigan in 1974. Raised in a deeply conservative Jehovah's Witness household, Christian grew up knowing structure, control, and judgment. His parents demanded obedience. There was little room for questioning, no holidays, no worldly distractions, just church, chores, and rules. But even as a child, Christian had a way of slipping through cracks. He wasn't wild, he was clever, charming. He learned quickly that he could avoid punishment not by rebelling, but by pretending. Pretending to be the perfect son, the perfect student, the perfect believer. He could lie with ease, and more importantly, with sincerity. That tendency followed him into adulthood. Christian never liked hard work. He never wanted to build his future slowly. He craved admiration, wealth, success, but he wanted shortcuts. He met MaryJane when he was in his early 20s. She was quiet, religious, and kind. Everything Christian seemed to be. Their relationship moved fast. MaryJane believed in Christian the way only someone raised to trust people could. They married quickly. Soon they had their first child, Zachery, followed by Sadie, and eventually little Madison. From the outside, the Longos were the picture of the American dream, a young couple with beautiful children, smiles in every photo, church every Sunday, polite manners. But underneath there was rot. Christian was drowning in debt. He had started a cleaning business, 4 seasons, but it was built on fiction. He forged documents, he stole, he lied to banks, landlords, clients. He opened credit cards in other people's names. MaryJane, ever loyal, trusted him. She believed things were tight, sure, but he always had a new plan, a new job offer, a new move that would solve everything. The reality was far worse. Christian was a con man spiraling deeper into his own lies. He moved his family constantly, Michigan to Ohio to Oregon, always escaping the fallout of his last deception. He would leave behind unpaid bills, angry clients, even lawsuits. He was eventually banned from renting cars after writing too many bad checks. He told everyone he was a successful businessman, a provider. In truth, he was unemployed, broke, and watching the walls close in. By December 2001, they were living in Newport, Oregon, in a small rental behind another house. No furniture, no savings, no prospects. MaryJane homeschooled the kids and tried to keep the family together. But she was thin, tired, and beginning to question her husband. The lies were harder to believe. There were too many, and Christian had grown cold, distant. He began staying out late, sometimes disappearing for entire nights. He blamed work, but there was no work. In truth, Christian had reached his breaking point. He resented his family, resented the pressure, the responsibility, the way their existence made him feel like a failure. And then somewhere in the dark corners of his mind, a thought began to form. If they were gone, he could start over. No baggage, no debt, no MaryJane asking questions, no children needing shoes or food or answers. Just him, a clean slate, a new life. The decision was made in secret, but it didn't take long to unfold. On or around December 16, 2001, Christian murdered MaryJane. He strangled her in the small rental home while the children were asleep in the next room. There were no screams. No neighbors heard anything. He wrapped her body in blankets, folded her into a suitcase, and left her there. The next morning, he made breakfast for the children, told them they were going on an adventure. They smiled, excited. They hadn't been out in days. He dressed them in warm coats and drove to the marina. At the Yaquina Bay dock, he rented a red canoe and paddled out with Zachery and Sadie. He told them it was a boat ride. They trusted him. They always did. Witnesses would later say they saw them laughing. But somewhere in the middle of the bay, surrounded by water and silence, Christian pushed both children into the freezing ocean and held them under. Sadie was 4. Zachery, 7. Their bodies were later found weighed down, wrapped in blankets, tied with rocks. Christian returned to shore alone. No one remembers seeing him come back. He walked away from the marina, returned to the rental, and took the suitcase with MaryJane's body to the Lint Slough. He dumped it quietly, letting the current carry it out of sight. But one child remained. Madison, just 2 years old, the baby of the family. In the days that followed, Christian didn't grieve. He didn't call the police. He didn't cry. Instead, he checked into a motel under a fake name, stole a car, and began driving south. He dumped Madison's body in a duffel bag, weighted with dumbbells, and threw it into the bay. Then he disappeared entirely. By the time MaryJane's suitcase was found, Christian was long gone. Police quickly traced the motel records, rental logs, and forged names. They realized what had happened, but it was already too late. The man everyone thought was perfect had killed his entire family and vanished. The search for Christian Longo would soon become one of the most intense manhunts in U.S. history. But at that moment, no one knew where he had gone or why. The only thing they knew for sure was that he had fooled everyone, his wife, his children, his neighbors, even himself. And that now, 4 innocent lives were gone. And the perfect man was now America's most wanted fugitive. For 6 days, Christian Longo drifted invisibly along the Oregon coast. The suitcase containing MaryJane's body had already been found, and by now, police had traced it back to the rental home in Newport. Detectives uncovered Christian's forged documents, aliases, and the family's sudden disappearance. Zachery and Sadie's bodies had surfaced in the Yaquina Bay. Madison was still missing, but investigators weren't hopeful. As the horror of the case spread across national headlines, so did Christian's name and face. Wanted posters were plastered across the Pacific Northwest. The FBI listed him as a suspect in a quadruple homicide. News anchors ran his picture with the phrase "extremely dangerous." But what terrified people most was not just what he had done. It was how normal he looked. No wild eyes, no violence in his face. He looked like a neighbor, a youth pastor, a father in a Target commercial. He looked safe. He wasn't. After leaving Oregon, Christian ditched the stolen car and began making his way south. He moved like a man with a plan, avoiding airports, sticking to back roads, paying cash. He didn't want to be found, and he didn't want to be himself anymore. On December 27, 2001, 8 days after dumping his last child's body in the water, Christian crossed the US-Mexico border and vanished completely. For weeks, he lived off-grid. He had some cash, stolen from MaryJane's purse, and scraped together from pawned items before the murders. He stayed in cheap hostels and small beachside towns along the coast of Mexico. Then as he moved deeper into hiding, something inside him shifted. The panic began to fade. He started talking to people again. And he told them a lie so bold, so strange, that no one questioned it. He said he was Michael Finkel. Michael Finkel was a real person, a respected journalist from the New York Times, A man whose face had once appeared in author photos and conference brochures. Christian had read his work. He had studied his voice. When asked who he was, Christian claimed he was taking a break from journalism. He told travelers he was working on a book, that he needed peace and solitude to focus. He played the part so well that no one suspected a thing. By January 2002, Christian had settled into a luxury resort in Tulum, living among backpackers, expats, and young writers. He charmed everyone. Staff remembered him as quiet, polite, well-read. He made friends at the resort's yoga sessions, laughed over drinks at the bar, even flirted with women on the beach. He seemed intelligent, kind, deep. No one knew that just a few weeks earlier, his children's lungs had filled with cold seawater beneath his hands. Back in the US, the manhunt was intensifying. Madison's body had finally been discovered, still in the duffel bag, waterlogged but identifiable. All 4 Longo children were confirmed dead. The story captured national headlines. News coverage was relentless. Christian Longo wasn't just a suspect, he was the embodiment of betrayal, the man who murdered the family that trusted him most. There were tips pouring in from all over the country, but none pointed to Mexico. No one imagined that Christian could vanish so easily or so completely. He might have gotten away with it forever, if not for a single mistake. At the resort in Tulum, Christian had befriended a German tourist named Jürgen. One night, over drinks, they got into a deep conversation about journalism, politics, and writing. Jürgen was impressed. "You speak like a professional," he said. Christian smiled. "That's because I am," he replied. "I write for the New York Times." Jürgen was intrigued. He'd read Michael Finkel's articles before, and the name stuck with him. Days later, Jürgen was back in Berlin, scrolling through the news online when he came across a photo. A man's face. Familiar. Chilling. He had seen that face in Tulum, but the name wasn't Michael Finkel. It was Christian Longo, and he was wanted for killing his wife and 3 children. Jürgen immediately contacted the US Embassy. The FBI acted quickly. Working with Mexican authorities, they narrowed the search. They traced the resort, and on January 13, 2002, Christian Longo was found walking calmly along the beach in Tulum, a paperback in hand, wearing sunglasses, tan and relaxed. When officers approached, he didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He gave a soft smile and said, "I know why you're here." He was arrested on the spot. News of the capture spread like wildfire. The American media erupted with coverage. A man who had murdered his entire family had been living like a tourist in paradise. For many, it was too much to stomach. The image of Christian lounging by the sea while his children's bodies were fished from the bay was unbearable. The betrayal felt personal. But what made the story even stranger was the real Michael Finkel. Back in the US, Finkel had just been fired from the New York Times for fabricating part of a story. He was in professional exile, ashamed, angry, lost. Then the phone rang. "There's a fugitive in Mexico," an FBI agent said, "and he's been using your name." Finkel was stunned. "Why me?" he asked. No one knew. Curious, confused, and slightly unnerved, Finkel reached out to Christian, then being held in a Mexican prison awaiting extradition. To his surprise, Christian responded. And more than that, he wanted to talk. He said he admired Finkel's work, said he felt a strange connection to him. Over time, they developed a correspondence. Dozens of letters, long phone calls, and eventually in-person interviews. Christian told Finkel he was innocent. He admitted that his wife and children were dead, but insisted that MaryJane had killed the kids in a moment of madness. He claimed he had found them, lost control, and killed her in a rage. He said he panicked, fled. That's all. But investigators and later prosecutors didn't buy it. There was no evidence to support his story. The timeline didn't match. The method didn't match. And the calm, calculated way in which he fled to Mexico painted a far more chilling picture. This wasn't a man grieving. This was a man escaping. By March 2002, Christian had been extradited to the United States. He was charged with 4 counts of aggravated murder in the state of Oregon. If convicted, he could face the death penalty. His trial would become a media circus, part courtroom drama, part psychological thriller. The quiet, well-spoken father who had once been admired by church communities across Michigan now stood accused of murdering the very people who loved him most. Through it all, Christian remained calm. He never cried in court, never showed anger. He smiled at the jury. Sometimes he even seemed amused. To many watching, it was terrifying. By the time Christian Longo was brought back to Oregon in early 2002, the weight of what he had done had started to settle over the courtroom like a black cloud. People packed the seats, reporters filled the back rows, and across the nation, Americans watched one of the most disturbing family murder trials in decades take shape. But inside the defendant's box, Christian sat quietly, composed, clean-cut. He wore a collared shirt and a soft expression. He didn't look dangerous. He looked misunderstood. It was almost as if he believed he could still talk his way out of it. The charges against him were brutal and absolute. 4 counts of aggravated murder, 1 for each of his children and 1 for his wife. Prosecutors announced early on that they would seek the death penalty. The evidence was overwhelming: physical, forensic, circumstantial. It all painted a picture of premeditation and cruelty. But Christian didn't flinch. He smiled at the judge. He thanked the guards. He was still playing the role of the good man caught in a bad situation. What stunned people most wasn't just that he'd murdered his family. It was that he was still trying to convince everyone that he hadn't. He pled not guilty. In opening statements, his defense team introduced a shocking theory. According to Christian, he had returned home one day to find his children dead, killed by MaryJane in a fit of despair. He claimed she'd been overwhelmed, worn down by poverty and emotional collapse. He said she had drowned the kids while he was out running errands. He claimed that in a state of rage, he had strangled her. The rest, the bodies, the suitcases, the escape to Mexico, was just panic. He hadn't planned it. He hadn't murdered his children. He had just lost control. The courtroom was quiet as he spoke. Jurors stared at him, some with disbelief, others with confusion. Could that be true? Was it even possible? After all, he didn't look like a killer. He didn't act like one. He had no prior violent history. He wasn't erratic or angry or unhinged. He was gentle, soft-spoken. He said ma'am and sir. He had the kind of face people trust. But the evidence told a different story. The prosecution dismantled his version piece by piece. The children's bodies had been found with items that only Christian would have packed: weighted duffel bags, his own personal blankets. There were no signs that MaryJane had committed any violence. The bruising on her neck was classic manual strangulation, not the result of a fight or a struggle. The timeline showed Christian alone with the kids after MaryJane's estimated time of death, and perhaps most damning, his behavior afterward. If his story were true, then why, after supposedly walking into a scene of horror, had he calmly packed their bodies, rented a canoe, drowned his children one by one, and vanished across international borders using a fake name? Why hadn't he called the police? Why hadn't he told anyone the truth? Why had he lived in luxury resorts in Mexico pretending to be someone else? The prosecution's case was brutal, precise, and emotionally devastating. They showed photos of the crime scene. They showed photos of the children: Zachery, 7, Sadie, 4, Madison, just 2. Jurors were visibly shaken. Some wept. When they showed a family video, taken just months before the murders, the room fell silent. There were the Longos, smiling and laughing, Christian holding Madison in his arms, his other children playing on the floor. It was a lie on tape. Witnesses were called, neighbors who had seen nothing, motel clerks who'd recognized Christian's picture, rental shop employees who identified him as the man with the canoe. Forensic experts described the manner of death in excruciating detail. The medical examiner's voice trembled slightly as she described how long it would have taken for the children to drown. Zachery likely fought. He had bruising on his arms, defense wounds. He was the oldest. He would have known what was happening. Christian didn't cry. He didn't even blink. In fact, at times during the trial, he seemed almost proud, like a man putting on a performance. He watched himself on courtroom footage, nodding slightly, as if agreeing with the way he looked on camera. He often made eye contact with the jurors. He was always polite to the judge. He knew how to perform. He had been doing it his entire life. But this time, it wasn't working. The turning point came when the real Michael Finkel, the journalist whose identity Christian had stolen in Mexico, was called to testify. The courtroom was buzzing with curiosity. What kind of man lets a murderer assume his name? Finkel explained how their strange relationship had developed. After Christian was arrested, he had begun writing Finkel letters, long, articulate, philosophical. He said he respected Finkel, admired him, wanted to be like him. In fact, Christian had read everything Finkel had ever published. He studied his voice, his syntax, even mimicked his mannerisms. It was like watching someone build a mask, Finkel said on the stand. Piece by piece, he created a new self, and when he put it on, it was seamless. He said Christian never showed guilt, only fascination. He seemed most alive when he was pretending. The jury watched Christian closely during Finkel's testimony. He nodded along, half smiling. It was the closest thing he'd ever had to a compliment. By the final days of the trial, the mood had shifted. The initial confusion, the disbelief that a father could do this, had been replaced by quiet certainty. The man sitting in front of them was not a broken husband or a grieving father. He was a performer, a manipulator, a liar, and above all, he was a killer. In closing arguments, the prosecution didn't beg for the death penalty. They didn't need to. They simply reminded the jury of the facts. 4 lives taken, all under Christian's care, and a man who had shown no remorse. They ended with a photo of the Longo family, smiling, innocent, unaware of what was coming. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On April 16, 2003, Christian Longo was found guilty on all 4 counts of aggravated murder. The sentencing phase followed. The state of Oregon hadn't executed a prisoner in years, but the law allowed for it in extreme cases. The question was, did Christian Longo deserve to die? His attorneys argued for life in prison. They said he was mentally unstable, that he'd been under immense stress, that he was still young. They said he could be rehabilitated. They begged the jury to consider the human side of Christian Longo. The prosecution asked a different question. What kind of human being murders his wife and 3 children and then drinks margaritas on a beach in Mexico under a stolen name? After days of testimony, impact statements, and final arguments, the jury gave their answer. Christian Longo was sentenced to death. Death row at Oregon State Penitentiary isn't loud. It isn't full of shouting or violence or chaos the way movies show it. It's quieter than that. Each inmate is kept alone, isolated for 23 hours a day, in a 7 by 10 foot concrete cell with a steel bed, a toilet, a slit of a window, and silence. It is a place meant for waiting, for reckoning, and for a man like Christian Longo, it should have been the end of the road, but it wasn't. After the jury sentenced him to death in 2003, Christian didn't weep. He didn't scream. He simply nodded, thanked the court, and walked away in shackles. The man who had murdered his entire family, who had lied, manipulated, and smiled through the trial, was now locked away with no cameras, no audience, no stage. For most people, that would be the end. But Christian Longo wasn't like most people. Within months of arriving on death row, he found a way to be heard again. It started with letters, long, articulate, handwritten pages sent to journalists, lawyers, former acquaintances. He wrote about philosophy, justice, family, memory, but not once did he show remorse. He never admitted guilt. Instead, he kept pushing the same narrative he had offered in court, that MaryJane had killed the children and he had only killed her in grief. He wanted people to believe it, and more than that, he wanted people to believe him. And then he found something new, a cause. In 2005, Christian Longo announced from behind bars that he wanted to donate his organs. All of them. Eyes, kidneys, liver, even bone marrow. I took 4 lives, he wrote in an open letter. If I could save 4 lives, it might be a way to atone. The public reaction was instant and divided. Some people called it manipulative. Others called it noble. Some even praised him for thinking of others despite his crimes. But critics, especially families of victims, saw it differently. This wasn't redemption, this was theater, and Christian was, once again, writing the script. Oregon prison officials shut the idea down immediately. Inmates on death row were not allowed to donate organs. It was too risky. It would require special facilities, coordination with hospitals, legal changes. It wasn't feasible, but Christian didn't stop. He formed a nonprofit, gave gifts of anatomical value from everyone, and pushed for national reform. He got interviews, he wrote op-eds, he spoke through intermediaries, and once again, the world was listening. Reporters interviewed him, psychiatrists analyzed him, and true crime writers began to dig deeper into the psyche of a man who seemed to crave one thing above all else: attention, and always, always control. Over time, the organ donation crusade faded from headlines. The law didn't change. Christian never donated a single organ, but the stunt had done its job. It had brought his name back into public discussion. It had made people debate him again. He wasn't just a killer, he was a complex man, a man of conscience, a man who wanted to give back. The truth, of course, hadn't changed. 4 innocent people were still dead. 3 of them were children. Over the next decade, Christian Longo continued to adapt to his environment. He became a model prisoner. He read obsessively. He learned the law. He filed appeals. He wrote personal manifestos. At one point, he offered to waive his appeals and accept execution. But then he changed his mind. He wrote to newspapers explaining why the justice system was broken. He debated capital punishment. He compared himself to other death row inmates. He became, in a bizarre way, an activist. But even in those letters, his true motive always bled through. He wanted to shape his legacy. He wanted to be remembered as more than what he had done. He wanted control over the ending. In 2011, the story took another strange turn. Michael Finkel, the real journalist whose identity Christian had stolen in Mexico, published a book, True Story, Murder, Memoir, Mea Culpa. It was a chilling, intimate look at Christian Longo, based on years of letters and interviews. Finkel admitted that Christian fascinated him. He described the killer as articulate, intelligent, almost likable, but also profoundly manipulative. The book examined the dangerous intimacy that developed between the 2 men, and it asked a dark, unforgettable question. Can evil wear a human face so convincingly that you forget what it really is? The book was a critical success, and in 2015, it was adapted into a major Hollywood film starring James Franco as Christian Longo and Jonah Hill as Finkel. The film, titled True Story, reignited public interest in the case. For a moment, the world remembered who Christian Longo really was. But even then, Christian seemed pleased. In the credits, his name appeared. His face was on posters again. He had always wanted fame. Now he had it. As of today, Christian Longo remains on death row in Oregon. He is now in his 50s, still appealing, still writing, still very much alive. But the state he lives in has since placed a moratorium on executions. In 2022, Oregon Governor Kate Brown officially commuted the sentences of all 17 inmates on death row, Christian Longo among them. Though not legally pardoned, he would no longer face execution. Instead, he will live out his remaining years in prison. A man who killed 4 people but may never face the punishment he was given. To this day, Christian Longo has never fully confessed to the murders of his children. He has never apologized. He continues to tell his version of the story. He continues to position himself as someone worth listening to. And perhaps that is the greatest danger of all. Because Christian Longo doesn't feel like a monster. He never has. He doesn't scream or gloat or threaten. He smiles. He speaks clearly. He says things that sound reasonable. But behind those words is a man who betrayed the people who loved him most. A man who looked at his family and saw not joy, not responsibility, not love, but inconvenience. He believed that if he could erase them, he could erase his failure. And now, locked in a concrete cell for the rest of his life, the one thing Christian Longo can never erase is memory. Not ours, not his. Not the image of Sadie's tiny hand gripping a stuffed animal. Not Zachery's laughter echoing across a canoe dock. Not MaryJane's quiet trust in the man she married. Not Madison's toddler footsteps on a motel floor. Those memories belong to all of us now.